that one of the factors that affects, probably motivates and propels his politics, and that is the personality. But besides personality, there is also ideology. Ideology, in case of Museveni, is a mystery. It's a mystery because, first of all, Museveni does not want people to know what his ideology is. And yet, in the history of Uganda, Museveni has been the most ideological president Uganda has ever had. He is a fanatic to some extent. When he holds on to an idea, he sticks with it. And that is regardless of all odds, all circumstances, and all situations. So, it sounds like a paradox. But first of all, before we plunge into Museveni's ideological politics, probably we need to understand what an ideology is and what it does to politics. If personality functions as the engine that drives the behavior of an individual, normal or pathological, then ideology within the political realm is the fuel that provides energy to propel the political engine residing within a personality to function and achieve specific political objectives. In previous conversations, we have compared the politics of Museveni to that of Muammar Gaddafi and Fidel Castro, using personality as an important factor. Now, we want to compare the role of ideology in the political behavior of Museveni and another character known as Bin Laden. To some, this comparison may look incongruent or far-fetched because Bin Laden was a die-hard jihadist, while Museveni, a former communist and a born-again Christian, may resemble an innocent lamb compared to Bin Laden, the vicious, hungry wolf. The truth, however, is that there is a lot of similarity between the two political actors when one looks closely at the ideologies that motivated their political behavior. Like Bin Laden, who believed in or used Islam to proclaim jihad, Museveni believes in political indoctrination as a means of controlling the political behavior of his followers. Museveni established the Jankwanzi political school for that purpose. Both Bin Laden and Museveni were driven by a degree of fanaticism that was incompatible with giving freedom of choice to the individuals they led. From the perspectives of both men, political freedom is not a permissible choice for the followers. In this respect, Museveni and Bin Laden are similar to identical political twins that descend promiscuously from a combination of repressed communist ideology and adulterated jihad theology with a proclaimed universal objective of converting the whole world to Bin Laden's brand of Islam. Ironically, there is no implication here that the two men would have loved each other if they had met anonymously in a secret cave. Nevertheless, all indicators are that the two crooks would have enormously admired each other's effective means of committing human atrocities. One of the intriguing questions is, how has Museveni managed to deceive Ugandans about his nefarious politics for so long? And how long can he continue to thrive on that kind of cunning deception? For example, many of Museveni's diabolic legislations, ranging widely from Public Order Management Act 2013 and the Anti-Homosexuality Act 2013 to the amendment of the Penal Code to prohibit sectarianism in 1987, were all driven by blind ideology disguised as a desire to protect African culture and root out sectarianism from Ugandan politics. So are the many assassinations of Museveni's political rivals. They were designed to exterminate reactionaries from Ugandan politics. The word reactionary is a favorite ideological tool in Museveni's political armory, as we shall soon illustrate. The good thing about Museveni, like all the other fanatic dictators of his ilk in the past, Gaddafi, Hussein, Mobutu, Bin Laden, is the fact that he has overestimated his intelligence. He has exaggerated his capabilities, and as is usual in such cases, Museveni, like all other dictators, has totally ignored history and undermined the abilities of his enemies because he's blinded by ideology. Ideologies or ideologues or fanatic believers in ideologies tend to assume that they can indefinitely manipulate society to their advantage using ideology. They have little or no understanding about the nature and inevitability of social change driven by historical forces which are beyond their control. They desperately try to prevent inevitable social change by using ideological indoctrination of their political captives. The communists, before the collapse of the Soviet Union, the apartheid leaders in the 70s and 80s, and the U.S. segregationists in the 1950s and 60s, and the leaders of the Chinese Cultural Revolution in the 1950s and 60s had similar objectives in mind. Nevertheless, they inevitably failed due to the forces of social change. So will Museveni. Both Bin Laden and Yoweri Museveni used their ideologies to justify the killing of those opposed to their views, who they labeled respectively infidels and reactionaries. The real cause of this behavior, however, is criminal psychopathy, rationalized as jihad or justifiable elimination of dangerous reactionaries, posing a threat to the security of the state, as Paul Kagame recently declared, or one may say threatened. Let us look more closely at the origin, the nature, and the effect of ideology in political behavior. Not surprisingly, there are many sources of ideology. These sources vary from political philosophy, social theory, culture, to racial prejudice and religion. Political philosophy, say, in its brand of liberalism, tends to have similar premises as its ideological form. The only difference between political liberalism and its ideological form is the rigidity of the latter. However, it is when a political philosophy loses its intellectual flexibility that it becomes rigid and dogmatic, thereby crystallizing into an ideology. Liberalism is a good example to illustrate this point. I will quote Ronald Dworkin, an eminent legal scholar, who gives us a good formulation of liberalism. Quote, in economic policy, liberals demand that inequalities of wealth be reduced through welfare and other forms of redistribution, financed by progressive taxes. They believe that government should intervene in the economy to promote economic stability, to control inflation, to reduce unemployment, and to provide services that would not otherwise be provided. But they favor a pragmatic and selective intervention over a dramatic change from free enterprise to wholly collective decisions about investment, production, prices, and wages. They support racial equality and approve government intervention to secure it through constraints on both public and private discrimination in education, housing, and employment. But they oppose the forms of collective regulation of individual decision. They oppose regulation of content of political speech, even when such regulation might secure greater social order. And they oppose regulation of sexual literature and conduct, even when such regulation has considerable majoritarian support. They are suspicious of the criminal law and anxious to reduce the extension of its provisions to behavior whose morality is controversial, and they support procedural constraints and devices like rules against admissibility of confessions that makes it more difficult to secure criminal convictions. Unquote. That is a description of liberalism. The conservative philosophy, on the other hand, would rather get rid of all government regulations, income redistribution, and progressive taxation. But, ironically, when it comes to morality, the conservatives are strictly, they prefer strict conformity to almost a religious code of conduct. So you can see that in U.S., the Tea Party brand or branch of republicanism has almost crossed the flexible line of philosophy into the rigid domain of ideology. As the Americans say, according to the Tea Party believers, it's my way or the highway. Social theory can also produce ideology. The best example, of course, is communism. The capital theory written by Karl Marx was converted into an ideology by Lenin and ruthlessly enforced by Stalin in the Soviet Union. The dictatorship of the proletariat became the supremacy of the Communist Party. Bourgeois ideas were outlawed, and any form of political opposition was a license to the Gulag Archipelago, as Alexander Solzhenitsyn amply documented. Communist ideology is quickly becoming history because the theory on which it was based is invalid. That is, the premises of the theory, the capital theory, have been rendered obsolete by history. Former communists like Yoweri Museveni are now truly political orphans, desperately looking for a new ideological orphanage. As we will soon discover, Museveni still hangs on to the communist concepts such as reactionary to describe and denigrate his political rivals. Another dead ideology is, of course, apartheid. Apartheid was the result of a fanatical interpretation of culture wrapped into racial prejudice. Apartheid racists even found a theological foundation for their cultural interpretation of their politics. They believed that each race was created by God with a specific destiny and had the right to a separate existence in order to preserve its culture intact or not to allow it to be polluted by other cultures. Clearly, apartheid ideology had a kinship with, but was different from Nazism in Germany and desegregation in the U.S. But as ideologies, they were all irrational and irrationally rigid. That is, racist, leaving no room for rational argument. Hence, the violent deaths of those ideologies. It is ironical that a religion presumed to be intended for salvation of the human soul can be a fertile field to breed a dangerous ideology. However, this is the case for Bin Laden's jihad ideology. Bin Laden even promised 7 virgins in heaven for each of his fanatic martyrs. Bin Laden, not surprisingly, did not seem eager to get the 7 virgins himself. The question is, what kind of God can offer such a reward to a person who kills innocent victims? The question is asked not to provide an answer to it, but in order to illustrate the nature of ideologies. They are rigid and irrational. Indeed, the ideologies do not make sense. That is why they are destined for extinction, a concept we deliberately borrow from Charles Darwin's The Origin of Species. In the cases of biological species, which are incapable of adapting to new conditions, they inevitably become extinct. Ideologies suffer a similar fate. In society, the main force acting as a lubricant that prevents political philosophy from crystallizing into a dogmatic ideology is political freedom. A constant critique of the premises of a political philosophy prevents it from rigidifying into a static ideology. Political freedom has a utility in preserving the health of a political system. No ideology is a friend to political freedom, unfortunately. And Yoweri Museveni is a good example as a leader of Uganda. As a matter of fact, I must say, that is why ideologies become extinct when they fail to adapt to new political conditions. I'll take a short break now, and I'll come back to expose the nature and the sources of Museveni's ideology. Thank you.
Fellow citizens,
You are listening to Voice of Uganda Radio, the mouthpiece of all Ugandans, wherever they may be, to voice their problems without fear of any retribution. The Voice of Uganda Radio works in sync with FADU, the Federalist Alliance of Democracy and Development in Uganda. FADU is an organization that was formed to work as a platform for all Ugandans at home and outside, to work synergistically to liberate our mother Uganda from the ruthless invaders that have sucked it dry. Therefore, Purdue invites all able Ugandans to act now and save the Ugandan humanity that is being slaughtered, destroyed, and robbed by a few people unworthy to call themselves Ugandans. Many people are crying for action in Uganda as they languish in misery. Purdue echoes their cries by making the loudest alarm to everyone to join Purdue, not tomorrow or the next day, but today. The number to join is 408-904-7038. The email is info@purdue.org.
We call upon people from the north and south, from the east and west, and yes, from the central province of Uganda to be loyal to one another. We must preserve our loyalty to human dignity. We call upon people once again not to wait until it is too late to begin thinking about a free Uganda. We call for a new attitude. Arise, fellow citizens, arise. Let us fight for a free Uganda. Museveni must.
Emyaka gino gyokka mu Museveni gyakulembera eggwanga bannayuganda bwe bategedde nti beenunula. Nze sikkaanya nabo, abalala bakkaanye nabo naye nze sikkaanya nabo, abo beenunula bokka.
Ndi musajja nsala za Uganda era ndi mutuuze munnansi w'eggwanga lino erya Uganda. Teyinza kutegeeza bannayuganda oba ensi yonna nti NRM yatununula, wabula NRM erinako abantu abatono ennyo abeenunula.
Uganda American Muslim Association invites you to the 6th annual meeting and conference. It will be held from July 11th, 2014 to July 13th, 2014 in Beltsville, Maryland. For more details, you can visit our website at uwamalink.org or call phone number 301-408-8417. Remember, it's every Muslim's duty to know of the plight of another Muslim. This is an opportunity for you to meet and know fellow Muslims from Uganda.
Fellow citizens.
You are listening to Voice of Uganda Radio, the mouthpiece of all Ugandans, wherever they may be, to voice their problems without fear of any retribution. The Voice of Uganda Radio works in sync with FADU, the Federalist Alliance of Democracy and Development in Uganda. FADU is an organization that was formed to work as a platform for all Ugandans at home and outside, to work synergistically to liberate our mother Uganda from the ruthless invaders that have sucked it dry. Therefore, FADU invites all able Ugandans to act now and save the Ugandan humanity that is being slaughtered, destroyed, and robbed by a few people unworthy to call themselves Ugandans. Many people are crying for action in Uganda as they languish in misery. FADU echoes their cries by making the loudest alarm to everyone to join FADU, not tomorrow or the next day, but today. The number to join is 408-904-7038. The email is info@purdue.org.
We call upon people from the north and south, from the east and west, and yes, from the central province of Uganda to be loyal to one another. We must preserve our loyalty to human dignity. We call upon people once again not to wait until it is too late to begin thinking about a free Uganda. We call for a new attitude. Arise, fellow citizens, arise. Let us fight for a free Uganda. Museveni must.
Short break. Back to continue with our conversation on Museveni's ideology. Of course, the best source to understand and study Museveni's ideology is his book, Sowing the Mustard Seed. So we shall refer to it because it is the best source so far of what Museveni says about ideology. However, there is a problem. When you read Sowing the Mustard Seed, there is a lot of ambiguity. Whether it is deliberate or not, it's not clear. However, most of the ambiguity in Sowing the Mustard Seed is the result, I think, of excessive use of common political terms loaded with unnecessary ideological content and political baggage. The purpose for this seems to be to allow Museveni, consciously or unconsciously, to be all things to all people. Many political terms and concepts are not defined and are in fact undefinable in the text, but they are used extravagantly with meanings that shift or change with the emotions they convey, deliberately or otherwise, by a specific political context in the story. Examples of the root terminologies we intend to examine to look at Museveni's ideology they include reactionary, revolutionary or revolution, even the term ideology itself. Museveni loves that term ideology. And the other one, of course, is one of his favorites, sectarianism. Obviously, these are not scientific terms, whether used by Museveni or anybody else. The importance of these terminologies or concepts is the fact that they are woven into both Museveni's social theory and his historical biological narrative. Museveni, for example, uses these terms to describe people or events he likes or dislikes. The social theory was, for example, used to eliminate the social theory I'm referring to is what we discussed in an earlier conversation, which Museveni calls the social metamorphosis theory. Was used to animate and legitimate Museveni's politics, especially in the Constituent Assembly, a debate which took place in 1994, 1995. To make ambiguity compounded, the four root terminologies I just referred to, reactionary, revolution, ideology, and sectarianism, are almost always combined with a suffix, a prefix, or an adverb that underlines or sometimes intensifies the ambiguity and the political message conveyed in the different contexts of the text where they are used. We have countless examples from the text to illustrate Museveni's conceptual ambiguity, largely arising from his ideology. First, we look at the word reactionary. The word reactionary, for example, seems to be the epitome of political evil in sowing the mustard seed. It is reserved for negatively labeling Museveni's worst political opponents. Museveni, for example, refers to reactionary forces in Uganda, who he denigrates using such derogatory terms as sub-imperialists. In other words, the Baganda are not only reactionary forces, they are also sub-imperialists. Other reactionaries are the members of UPC, of course. Museveni regrets that, quote, it was tragic to see incapable reactionaries taking our country towards civil conflict while thinking they were being very smart, unquote. Other reactionaries in sowing the mustard seed are, of course, the Acholi. The Acholi after the coup d'etat against Obote in 1985. Imagine that they could invite the NRM to be co-opted into this reactionary grouping, unquote. Political organizations Museveni personally disagreed with are labeled reactionary. Museveni, for example, writes that, quote, during the anti-Obote struggle 1981 to 86, we had the same problem with mini groups, such as the Uganda National Rescue Front, led by Moses Ali, and other reactionary groups. For example, the Uganda Freedom Movement, UFU, and the Federal Democratic Movement, FEDEM, which were trying to use the Baganda as on a sectarian basis, unquote. These are the words of a man who supposedly honestly presided over the so-called broad-based government. Museveni later on called the same people swine. A reactionary is clearly an individual whose politics Museveni disagrees with. It is a subjective and abusive label. How can it, therefore, be possible for a leader who genuinely and honestly deals with individuals he refers to as reactionaries in the so-called broad-based government? This is the man of all the people in his government, in his cabinets from 1986 onwards. Many of them were labeled reactionaries. Why then put them into the so-called broad-based government? Museveni is not now, and in 1986 was not honest. That's the answer. Objective history should avoid such subjective labels because they are meaningless in the long run. But to an ideologue like Museveni, they contain all the meanings he wants to convey at different times and places. Let us look at revolutions and revolutionaries. Apparently, the opposite of a reactionary in sowing the masterpiece seed is the revolutionary. The term, as used in the book, is given a positive connotation as compared to the negative, obviously politically detested reactionary. The term reactionary, nevertheless, has it has no clear definition, even though it is sharply contrasted with the revolutionary. Any person or organization opposed to NRM policies or beliefs earns the title of a reactionary, even though the spectrum covering all those opposed to NRM policies or beliefs is very wide, thereby stretching the ambiguity of who a reactionary actually is. Surprisingly, the term revolutionary, though positive in Museveni's subjective understanding or ideological understanding of politics, does not appear as extensively throughout the text of his book as the other three terms or concepts. The explanation seems to be that the fact that in Museveni's political world, there are very few revolutionaries. Revolutionaries are very rare, just like Museveni himself and his personal heroes, Muammar Gaddafi, Julius Nyerere, and Fidel Castro. These are the true contemporary revolutionaries during Museveni's political career. The political implication of these associations are obvious. To be a revolutionary, you must believe in a certain ideology, which Museveni believes in, but strenuously, nevertheless, refuses to acknowledge publicly. That is another aspect of Museveni's political deception. Why should a leader who embraces Muammar Gaddafi, Julius Nyerere, and Fidel Castro because of their ideologies, then be ashamed to embrace publicly the same ideologies they believe in? No wonder revolutionaries are showered with praise. For example, Museveni writes that, quote, the Tanzanians, for their part, were hesitant to fight us. That is during the Bush War, 1981 to 86, because they knew that we were a serious force of dedicated revolutionaries. And this presented them with a dilemma, unquote. At no point in the book are the Tanzanians described as reactionaries, even though at various points in Museveni's story, the Tanzanians were clearly opposed to what Museveni and his organization from NASA were doing. The hint from the Tanzanian case is that the terms reactionary and revolutionary are actually ideological labels with the opposite meanings. They have little, if any, objective historical meanings in Museveni's story. They are not scientific terms, even though they are used in Museveni's social theory of the metamorphosis theory, which we discussed earlier. The next time we encounter the term revolutionary in Museveni's swearing in ceremony on January 29, 1986. The context is self-explanatory. Quote, in my address to the nation, I made 3 major points. First, I explained that this change of government was a fundamental revolution and not a mere change of guard. Our thinking was radically different from previous regimes which had been sectarian and neo-colonial, presiding over an economy which was not properly integrated. Unquote. That is Museveni speaking on his inauguration when he was swearing in to become president. Well, the thing is, of course, the economy he presides over today is worse than what it was, the one he found. The security situation is worse. The change he calls revolutionary, one wonders what kind of revolution he's talking about. Nothing has changed. In fact, things have gotten worse. So the term revolution also appears when Museveni meets Mobutu on the same day after his inauguration. Quote, perhaps he, meaning Mobutu, was worried by the force of example, the people of Uganda throwing the established order by a popular revolution. Unquote. Besides a popular revolution, whatever that may mean, there is also the counter-revolution. When NRM assumed the power in January 1986, Museveni and his colleagues automatically ceased to be insurgents. Those who had been in power, in turn, became insurgents. Museveni writes about one of them. He, Lieutenant Colonel Oduo, was eventually killed at Konakilak in January 1987 when he became the counter-revolutionary insurgency armed opposition which had started in 1986. Unquote. It is obvious that when NRM insurgents won the war, they blessed themselves with the term popular revolution. But due to conceptual ambiguity inherent in the term, it is unlikely that Museveni would apply the same term to another victorious insurgency other than NRM. But during their time in the bush as insurgents, Museveni never referred to his men as counter-revolutionaries. These terms are therefore inherently biased and ambiguous. Their use is always political, ideological, and subjective. Inevitably, these terms end up robbing Museveni's story of any authenticity and objectivity. So, what about the term ideology itself? A term that appears far more frequently than either reactionary or revolutionary is, of course, ideology. Museveni seems to have fallen in deep love with the word and the concept, ideology. In a recent speech read for him by Major General Wilson Mbadi in Kasese, that was, I think it was a year ago, Museveni said, quote, Uganda now has a good army. This is a problem for the past governments because they did not know how to build it as they lacked ideology. Ideology? From the way we looked at ideology, the concept, ideology to be the best way to build an army? Well, what on earth did Museveni mean when he used the term ideology in the context of the army? We can take this recent use of the term ideology to indicate that Museveni does not understand the concept of ideology. Even more important, Museveni does not realize that armies in democratic systems should never be indoctrinated with a specific ideology, since different political parties have different ideologies. Politicization of state institutions, the army, the police, the civil service, is contrary to the basic tenets of democracy and democratization. So you can see that for Museveni, ideology is destiny, and every state institution must be politicized in the ideology Museveni believes in. So you see the problem anybody coming after Museveni will have. How do you deprogram an army or a police force programmed, especially by its leaders at the so-called political school in Chankwanzi? The term ideology, however, seems to be a double-edged political sword in the text of sowing the mustard seed. Those whose ideology is compatible with the Museveni or the NRM are good. Others, apparently, are evil. However, in the past, before they were politically purified, there were members of NRM with, quote, ideological limitations of some of the members of our external committees, unquote. He seems to be talking about, you know who? Amama Mbabazi was one of those people prominent in the external committees. And it so happens that Amama Mbabazi was not properly politicized, probably. There were people who were described in the book as politically incompetent, apparently because they are ideologically bankrupt. The DP leadership is described as one with ideological limitations of its leadership. And the leader of DP is described as politically and ideologically myopic person. Obviously, the person these references to DP leader in the solving of the master dispute published in 1997 refer to Paul Semugere, and not to Norbert Mao, who was later on elected leader of DP. So ideologically myopic is Paul Semugere. Now, these are the people he was working with in the cabinet. Paul Semugere was Minister of Internal Affairs, Minister of Foreign Affairs, and yet he's political and ideologically myopic person, and you allow him to sit in your cabinet? So what kind of a man is this Museveni? Some ideologies apparently, according to Museveni, are better than others. That surprises me from what I've said in the introduction about ideologies. How one ideology can be better than another. The criteria for judging the superiority of an ideology seems to depend on Museveni's personal desires. Here we have cracked the riddle within which the enigma of dictatorship resides. Tolerance of political views of others. For example, the Kikosi Malam, or KM, that is Obote's UPC military wing in Tanzania, quote, had a pathological fear of Fronasa, precisely because they recognized our capacity to organize, our clean record, and our superior ideology. Unquote. Apart from political arrogance, it is not clear what criteria Museveni used to determine which ideology was superior to another. All ideologies are the same. They are frozen, dogmatic political philosophies. They are sterile. Once they are frozen, they cease to be rational guides of political action. About Kikosi Malam, Museveni further writes that, quote, our attitude to KM was readiness to cooperate with them, although preferably not to join them because of their wrong-headed ideology and methods. This event of removing Lulé from power is the event he's talking about, was brought about in essence by any democratic culture, or you can substitute culture here with ideology. The army had to be organized on the basis of ideology. Museveni writes that it was especially important that the army, which was really a colonial relic, should be disbanded completely and a new people's army created on the basis of a new ideology of nationalism. The concept of people's army is, of course, not original to Museveni. Museveni has never been original thinker. Museveni has never been a creative thinker either. People's army is a socialist communist idea or formula. Is the U.S. Army less nationalistic than the Chinese Army simply because the Chinese Army is labeled or described as the People's Army, but the U.S. Army is not described as a People's Army? So why confuse nationalism, which is universal, with ideology, which is particularistic? The game of politics, in Museveni's view, is categorized and justified by the type of ideology involved or one he believes in. According to Museveni, for example, quote, political intrigues among politicians had so weakened the mass movements such as DP and UPC that Amin just picked up the mantle of power from a political leadership emasculated by its own ideological narrowness and its unprincipled conduct of state and political affairs, unquote. It would seem that according to Museveni, corruption only infects those who are infected and incapacitated by bad ideologies and blind personal ambition. Evidence of extensive corruption under NRM in Uganda today, notwithstanding. Corruption within NRM was extensively exposed by the Human Rights Watch publication or report recently, and therefore we need not dwell on that. If ideology is causing all the corruption in Uganda, then such an ideology is not good for Uganda, and this is NRM ideology. Seven, for example, seems to recollect, quote, my brief experience with UNLF administration, in which I occupied senior positions as Minister of Defense and later Vice Chairman of the Military Commission, which succeeded Godfrey Binaisa's administration, showed me that it is easy to create unity among the people, provided one who has personal ambitions of self-advancement, one is not corrupt, and one is ideologically clear and politically perceptive. And what? This is a direct quote from Museveni. Can you believe it? He thinks ideologies can eliminate corruption. Well, it has not done so under his 28 years. In fact, the situation is getting worse. Only God could accurately decipher the meaning of the latter sentence we've quoted in light of all the corruption and the thirst for power widely reported from Kampala as late as last month, with the people being executed in China because of corruption and being sent there by people within the government. If it is incredible that anybody can talk about ideology being a cure of corruption in any system anyway. Such statements are, however, quite revealing in themselves about the character of Yoweri Kaguta Museveni as a person. He wants to be everything to everybody. But worst of all, hypocrisy is masquerading as objective or even good ideology. Sometimes the terms personalities and ideologies are confused or even used interchangeably. For example, quote, the DP was led by conservative men who had limited perspectives both in terms of ideology and modes of struggle. In terms of ideology, they confined themselves to colonial and neo-colonial ideas, unquote. And on the other hand, quote, the UPC was largely composed of lumpen bourgeoisie. Ideologically, they, the UPC leaders that is, were bankrupt. And as a result, they were certainly unequal to the task of national emancipation, unquote. Well, that tells us a lot about Museveni and the concept of ideology. I think Karl Marx was right for this particular concept, that ideologies distort reality. Museveni is not aware of it. It would seem, according to the last sentence quoted, that ideology by itself is believed to instill political capacity in individual politicians. Something we have in our introduction tried to clarify is impossible. Otherwise, communism, apartheid, desegregation, the Chinese Cultural Revolution would have succeeded. They did not. They became extinct. And the only explanation is because of their ideologies. Generally, however, politicians at the time of independence were politically and ideologically bankrupt, according to Museveni. As we shall see later on, Museveni believes that sectarianism was responsible for causing what he says philosophers call ideological obscurantism, which means obscuring the truth in order to serve the interests of the clique. I referred to Karl Marx earlier on. He was the one who used actually this term. But Museveni, he is narrow-mindedness. He has appropriated the same concept and thinks it still makes sense. And beyond what Karl Marx had to say about it. If that is true, this concept of ideological obscurantism, which Museveni loves to say, and when he says it, he gleams, and you should look at his face when he says that phrase. To him, I think it's like a biblical prophet pronouncing some news for the human race. If that is true, that is the concept of obscurantism. Does it mean that ideological obscurantism never infects or blinds NRM members? How do we explain Museveni's ideological ambiguity? To add the confusion to ambiguity, Museveni believes that there is such a state of political affairs known as ideological underdevelopment. that caused the political problems within UPC in 1964. He has misread history, or probably the better way to say it is, he has misunderstood. He cannot understand what was going on in 1966 was the politics of the personalities involved, namely Milton Obote. It would not have made any difference which ideology Obote believed in at that time. The results would have been the same because the personality was driving that particular political process then. We now know that economic policies in the modern political systems are largely ideological in content. Museveni, however, seems to think out otherwise, and yet Museveni's interpretation of the way the economy functions is very similar to, if not the same as, that of the communists and socialists like Julius K. Nyerere, whom he admired tremendously, as he narrates the story in Sowing the Mustard Seed. I was reading quotations recently from in the Monitor, quotations from Museveni, and one of the quotations, Museveni was at Namugongo, the Saints' Shrine, and he said Nyerere was the greatest African leader in history. Now, he said this very recently, 2011, I think. And he does not want to recognize Mandela as greater than Nyerere. It is important for me to point out here the difference between Nyerere and Mandela. Nyerere was a socialist. He was the man, the founder, the author of the Ujamaa policies in Tanzania. The Ujamaa policy failed. It failed. It means you go to Tanzania today, you will not find any Ujamaa village. Nyerere realized that, and in 1985, he acknowledged the failures of his policies and retired. Now, if a failure can be the greatest African leader, as opposed to Nelson Mandela, who succeeded in ending apartheid and also avoiding a bloodbath. He reconciled the races and the ethnic groups in South Africa. It was no small task. Only a morally upright individual like Mandela could have done it. So you call that, how can you say Nyerere was the greatest African leader in spite of the clear evidence that Mandela was actually far greater than Nyerere? A failure was chosen to be the greatest leader as opposed to a successful leader like Mandela. Well, I leave that for you to judge. I only give you the evidence to consider and reach your own verdict. But it is important why Museveni was motivated to say that, because he was at the Martha's shrine at Namugongo, and he wanted, to please the people who were listening. That's all. In fact, he said that he was going to pray more so that Nyerere becomes a saint. Well, let us wait and see. But even if he became a saint, I don't think that would really make Nyerere greater than Mandela. I don't think so. In fact, Museveni cannot separate his understanding of colonialism, imperialism, and capitalism from ideology. When the Europeans, that's a quotation, when the European exploiters first set foot in Africa in the 15th century, the natural process of growth and advancement towards higher forms of civilization was interrupted and distorted. This affected both the economies and the people of Africa, writes Museveni. The dominant exploitative relations in production, distribution, and exchange were imperialist, capitalist ones, which have always worked to the detriment of the African people, unquote. However, according to Museveni, ideologies can also be personalized. For example, quote, Obote's only ideology was and is power, and I recognize that in him, unquote. Because Obote's only ideology was power, Museveni argues that he, quote, Obote provoked divisions even within his own party, unquote. At a certain level, Museveni, too, took ideology to be a personal quality of an individual. Reflecting on his student role, for example, he remembers that, quote, one role in the student movement had three effects. It radicalized and deepened the ideological content of our thinking. It made us quite well known on the African scene, especially in the liberation movement circles. It reinforced our Pan-Africanist views and established us to make Pan-Africanist contacts, such as President Nyerere. Then Museveni adds that, quote, because we were politically active, our group attracted the attention of various communist regimes, which were keen to attract students to their side in the Cold War, which was at its height at that time, unquote. I'm glad Museveni wrote this because it gives us a very good illustration of what ideology is and does. That's why I prefaced these remarks with a description of what ideology is and what it does, and why the nature of ideologies, that they are dogmatic, sterile philosophies, they are rigid, and they eventually become extinct, like a communism, apartheid, Nazism, and many others. Now, when Museveni mentions about the Cold War, what he fails to understand is that during that period, there was this idea, especially in Africa, that an ideology can be good, and Museveni still believes in that, from what I've just quoted from him, that an ideology can be as beautiful as an angel, can, do wonderful things. Well, maybe he doesn't draw a distinction between ideology and political philosophy. Political philosophy is a different animal from ideology. And the reason why ideology, the Cold War, was based on ideology, and the communism failed and is now extinct in accordance with the Darwin's law of survival of the fittest. So, to cite the Cold War as the best example of showing a good ideology is very absurd, to say the least. So in sowing the mustard seed, for most of the time, Museveni does not distinguish between policy and ideology, inevitably leading to conceptual ambiguity. Nevertheless, sometimes Museveni distinguishes between policy and ideology. Everything depends on the context. Referring to political activities at the time of independence, he writes, quote, "The so-called party workers never had time to go down to the grassroots to do organizational work. Instead, they created hysteria by setting people against each other, polarizing them along the lines of their tribal or religious identity. There was nothing about ideology or policies." Unquote. Well, I think Museveni is, of course, mistaken. Yeah, he was, of course, proceeding on the premises of his invalid social theory of social metamorphosis, which we already know. If a theory is invalid, it can't give you a valid explanation of what is going on. It cannot be used to remedy a situation. It's like taking cyanide and thinking that it may cure your headache. It will kill you instead. Same with ideologies, because they are irrational and they are rigid, and they are not designed to advance the political process because they don't support political freedom. I'll stop here for a few minutes, and I'll come back to conclude our discussion of Museveni's ideology and how it influences his politics.
Fellow citizens,
You are listening to Voice of Uganda Radio, the mouthpiece of all Ugandans, wherever they may be, to voice their problems without fear of any retribution. The Voice of Uganda Radio works in sync with FADU, the Federalist Alliance of Democracy and Development in Uganda. FADU is an organization that was formed to work as a platform for all Ugandans at home and outside to work synergistically to liberate our mother Uganda from the ruthless invaders that have sucked it dry. Therefore, FADU invites all able Ugandans to act now and save the Ugandan humanity that is being slaughtered, destroyed, and robbed by a few people unworthy to call themselves Ugandans. Many people are crying for action in Uganda as they languish in misery. FADU echoes their cries by making the loudest alarm to everyone to join FADU, not tomorrow or the next day, but today. The number to join is 408-904-7038. The email is info@fadu.org.
We call upon people from the north and south, from the east and west, and yes, from the central province of Uganda to be loyal to one another. We must preserve our loyalty to human dignity. We call upon people once again not to wait until it is too late to begin thinking about a free Uganda. We call for a new attitude. Arise, fellow citizens, arise. Let us fight for a free
Uganda. Ekolaganira wamu n'ekibiina ekya Federalist Alliance of Democracy and Development in Uganda, FADU. Ebigendererwa by'ekibiina kino kuzza mirembe, enkolagana ey'awamu, obwenkanya, okuggyawo enkola y'omwana waani, n'okusosola mu mawanga, okutulugunya, okulya enguzi, ebikudde ejjembe mu Uganda. Era kirwanirira okuzza enfuga eya demokrasiya mu Uganda. Ekibiina kino kye kisookedde ddala okukubiriza buli muntu yenna okukyegattako awatali kusosola mu mawanga n'enzikiriza oba ekitundu omuntu kyalimu mu nsi yonna. Kino kye kiseera twegatte tusobole okuzza obupya ensi yaffe Uganda edobonkanyizibwa. Buli eyandyagadde okwegatta ku kibiina kya FADU kuba ennamba eno 1-8-9-7-3-8 oba weeyambise email info@fadu.org.
Emyaka gino gyokka Mwami Museveni gyakulembera eggwanga bannayuganda be bategedde nti beenunula. Nze sikkaanya nabo, abalala bakkaanye nabo naye nze sikkaanya nabo, abo beenunula bokka.
Ndi musajja nsala za Uganda era ndi mutuuze munnansi w'eggwanga lino erya Uganda. Teyinza kutegeeza bannayuganda oba ensi yonna nti NRM yatununula, wabula NRM eyinako abantu abatono ennyo abeenunula.
fellow citizens.
You are listening to Voice of Uganda Radio, the mouthpiece of all Ugandans, wherever they may be, to voice their problems without fear of any retribution. The Voice of Uganda Radio works in sync with FADU, the Federalist Alliance of Democracy and Development in Uganda. FADU is an organization that was formed to work as a platform for all Ugandans at home and outside to work synergistically to liberate our mother Uganda from the ruthless invaders that have sucked it dry. Therefore, FADU invites all able Ugandans to act now and save the Ugandan humanity that is being slaughtered, destroyed, and robbed by a few people unworthy to call themselves Ugandans. Many people are crying for action in Uganda as they languish in misery. FADU echoes their cries by making the loudest alarm to everyone to join FADU, not tomorrow or the next day, but today. The number to join is 408-904-7038. The email is info@fadu.org.
We call upon people from the north and south, from the east and west, and yes, from the central province of Uganda to be loyal to one another. We must preserve our loyalty to human dignity.
After a short break, I'm back to conclude there's conversation on the politics, Museveni's politics, driven by ideology. Museveni, his policies in the army, for example, are also a good example where the distinction between policy and discipline and ideology are not distinguished. Museveni, for example, writes that, quote, in order to build a new national army like ours, however, it is essential, first of all, to clarify the ideology of the armed forces and establish a firm code of conduct that will be respected and adhered to. In this previous sentence, there seems to be confusion between discipline and ideology of soldiers. And yet Museveni comments later on that, quote, previous armies in Uganda were brutal because they came from the colonial system, unquote. That's not true because there is no causal relationship between the army having been colonial in origin and its being brutal. Museveni's army has brutally murdered innocent Ugandans in order to allow Museveni to cling to power. It does not have a colonial origin. Colonial armies were disciplined, if discipline means strictly conforming to the rules and standards set by the commanders. The post-colonial armies became brutal after they were politicized or indoctrinated with specific ideologies. Politicized armies are the primary perpetrators of state terrorism, whether under apartheid, Idi Amin, Milton Obote, or Yoweri Kaguta Museveni. Dictators interpret the mission of the army as one of carrying out political orders rather than executing military objectives. Museveni's army today behaves in exactly the same way as Obote's army in 1966 and 1980s, or Amin's armies in 1970s, as the events of September 2009 and the election of February 18, 2011 clearly demonstrate. UPDF has partisan political objectives and not a nationalistic military mission. In fact, Museveni is proud of the fact that UPDF is politicized. But we cannot attribute the brutality of Museveni's army to colonialism. Museveni attributed the brutality of Obote's and Amin's armies to colonial relic. However, Museveni's army is equally brutal as the Obote's and the Amin's armies. Everything depends on the orders given to the army and why the orders are given. Ideology is irrelevant under those circumstances. Later on, Museveni writes that, quote, the ideological realization of where your fundamental interests lie is crucial if the mission is to succeed. Thus, success depends on a clear understanding of the mission, both by civilian soldiers and upon ideological organization or discipline. Recruitment into the armed forces since those early days of the NRM has been based on recommendations from the local village councils and committees who must vouch for a recruit's character and personal discipline. In this way, Museveni writes, the recruiting team would only be concerned with health and physical fitness because the ideological and psychological factors had already been taken care of. Unquote. How would the ideological factors be taken care of before a soldier is recruited through the recommendation of the villagers? This statement implies that ideology is either a personal quality or a cultural element shared by all members of society. And yet, clearly, that is not the meaning of ideology Museveni intended to convey. There may be multiple ideologies, but there is always one culture in a specific society or ethnicity. When it came to dealing with the real ideological issues in organizing the economy, Museveni was either evasive or tried to draw distinctions where there were no differences. Museveni argued, for example, quote, we were able to remove the privatization and free enterprise debate from the realm of ideology and saw that it was part of the actual tactics of building the economy, unquote. Museveni seems to be claiming to possess a skill no human being possesses. How can anyone remove privatization and free market debate from the realm of ideology? Privatization and free markets are concepts that are inherently part and parcel of liberalism. Liberal philosophy, that is, the one I quoted earlier. In their essence, these concepts are by nature ideological. They cannot be removed from ideology. Here we have to be careful, as I pointed out, that ideology is when the political philosophy becomes dogmatic and ceases to be rational. So we have to be, as long as there is political freedom, a political philosophy is prevented from becoming an ideology or a dogma, and that it remains rational, like liberalism, as I quoted you. As long as political freedom is protected, you can avoid that. But when there is no political freedom, like in the Soviet Union and under apartheid, you will not have the same impact on the political freedom, on the political philosophy. So the quotation from Museveni shows that Museveni does not want to call a spade when it comes to his personal beliefs and ideology. Having been a socialist with deep faith in the virtues of state enterprises, Museveni found it difficult in the 1980s and early 1990s to confess that the economic policies that were forced on him by the IMF and the World Bank were actually not only viable, but also truly capitalistic or liberal. Museveni's ideological ambiguity continues in spite of the fact that he has accepted capitalism as his political creed. Or maybe he hasn't, because we really don't know. For ideological and political reasons, especially his friendship with Julius Nyerere, Muammar Gaddafi, and Fidel Castro, Museveni does not want to publicly identify himself as a capitalist. This is so in spite of the fact that Museveni and his family own extensive interests in businesses obviously acquired corruptly. To some extent, this ambiguity both causes and explains corruption under NRM regime. In concluding our conversation on Museveni and ideology, we can say that Museveni's idea of ideology is not only misconceived, but strictly personal. It portrays an inflated ego. Museveni treats ideology as a personal item, such as clothing. If you like the color of your clothing, you can call it beautiful. But you must be respectful of the tastes of others. That is political freedom. Do not abuse them simply because they prefer to wear the colors you do not like. That is the essence of freedom. Freedom allows individuals and groups to choose what they prefer. In the case of Museveni, when others choose a different color or ideology, it is of political philosophy in this context, it is equivalent to committing a crime. Just as we compared him to Bin Laden, he relies on indoctrination to convert people to his point of view. He does not, in other words, believe in political freedom, just like Bin Laden. The other people become reactionaries or totally unacceptable in their political behavior. This personalized approach to ideology drains out its content according to one's preferences. This is not what ideology means. The American College Dictionary defines ideology as a body of doctrine, myths, and symbols of a social movement, institution, class, or large group. This means that an ideology like a religion is collectively owned by the group which believes in it. It does not belong to an individual who unilaterally arrogates to himself the power to determine and define its content or what a specific ideology is, as Museveni does for the sole purpose of serving his personal political interests. So it is clear that by studying Museveni's views of ideology, we get deep into his character, and hence we can understand and explain his repressive political behavior. Museveni adopts a similar approach when it comes to sectarian politics. The next favorite political term Museveni loves to flip around is sectarianism. This term also contributes to conceptual ambiguity in sowing the mustard, the seed. This concept, which is both theoretical and political, enhances our understanding of Museveni's political theories, politics, and and ideology later on. In his reflection on the war in the Luwero Triangle, Museveni characterized the UFM led by Andrew Kaira as a sectarian organization. We saw earlier that the same organization was described as reactionary. UFM being sectarian, Museveni writes, came out during the debate whether the monarchy in Uganda should be restored. On his part, Museveni writes, quote, "We argued that we were fighting to restore power and sovereignty to all the people of Uganda, and that it would be up to the people to decide how they used this freedom. If they wanted to restore a monarchy, that would be up to them, not us," unquote. That sentence right there sounds untruthful. Museveni, it would appear to us, did not fight to restore power and sovereignty to the people. That is not what he has done during the last 28 years. Prohibiting Ugandans to walk to work to guarantee does not amount to guaranteeing their sovereignty. Arming and recognizing and cheating, creating Sabanyala and Savaruri is not protecting the cultural values of Uganda. I'm not even sure Museveni knows what the terms sovereignty and freedom mean. If he did, then he is the greatest hypocrite who ever lived in Uganda. More specifically, Museveni accuses Kaira of double dealing during the debate when they held in the bush. On the one hand, Museveni writes that Kaira was openly supporting the restoration of the monarchy, but his true motives were to promote support for DP. Museveni then declares, quote, "In this way, and in that audience, which was 100% Baganda, we were able to defeat this sectarian opportunistic group, which in some fora would claim to be working for the Baganda and in others for DP. We defeated them politically without using any military means. Later on, of course, Kaira died by what Museveni calls military means." Museveni's argument does not sound genuine. First of all, most Baganda have multiple allegiances. They may believe in their political parties as much as they pay loyalty to the Kabaka. That does not mean that they are either sectarian because they advance the cause of their political party, or opportunistic because they are loyal to the institution of the kingship at the same time. A conclusion to that effect is either malicious, that is, intended to malign the intentions of the individual, or a failure to understand Kiganda culture and the behavior of the Baganda, or appreciate the very essence of the concept of freedom. One person can have multiple allegiances. That situation is not contrary to the law, and it is not sectarian. Another area where Museveni's political lenses focus on sectarianism is, of course, political parties. This issue is discussed more extensively, and the topic of social metamorphosis theory. So we don't need to repeat that here. In 1980, during the campaign for elections, Museveni, the crusader against political parties, saw the political solution to his ambitions in forming his own political party. Quote, "So we formed the Uganda Patriotic Movement in spite of knowing that it would have a poor chance at the elections, since issues were already polarized along sectarian lines." Unquote. Museveni's attempt to portray the political parties in 1980 as sectarian is neither accurate nor convincing. We shall use his story to demonstrate the contrary. The alleged sectarianism within the political parties in 1980 could not have prejudiced Museveni in his political quest for the elective office in Ankole, as he alleges. The facts are clear. Museveni himself writes, quote, "Having belonged to the DP myself in the 1960s, I had quite a number of friends who wanted me to rejoin the DP. I did not agree with this, however, because I thought that uniting Ugandans was more important than electoral success. In this context, joining the old sectarian parties would have been the wrong move. Following the collapse of UNLF and the UPC and DP pressure, I believed that the correct thing to do in 1980 was to abstain from both those parties." Well, it is important to point out that Museveni didn't run for parliamentary seat in 1980 elections as a UPM leader. He ran against DP candidate Sam Kutesa and lost. Sectarianism did not play any role in Museveni's loss to Kutesa DP of DP party. First, both candidates were ethnic Bahima from Ankole, and both were Protestants. Therefore, neither religious nor societal, that is ethnic sectarianism, as defined by Museveni himself, played a role in Museveni's loss to Kutesa, as Museveni would want us to believe. Even more important is the fact that anyone similar with the situation at the time agrees that DP overwhelmingly won the elections in 1980, but the results were rigged by Mwanga, who stopped the counting and changed the result and declared the results by proclamation. We discussed this issue sufficiently elsewhere, so we don't need to do it again. Even more important, DP would not have won those elections on a sectarian basis due to the demographic factors. The Catholics and Protestants are almost each the same percentage of the population of Uganda, about 42% of the population. Therefore, neither religious group could have overwhelmingly won the election without the significant support from both religious groups. Museveni himself knows this fact. It therefore means that Museveni's theory of sectarianism is undermined not only by his own participation in and loss to a DP candidate, but also by the general results of the 1980 elections. In fact, the results of 1980 elections were good testimony to the fact that Ugandan society had undergone substantial social change since 1962, when the last election was held. So the story in brief is that sectarianism is an ideological concept when Museveni uses it. It is not a scientific concept. And even when it uses it in his theory of metamorphosis, which we proved to be wrong, it does not apply. So, in conclusion, we say that ideology, just like personality, overrides everything else in Museveni's consciousness and political behavior. And unfortunately, ideologies being what they are, dogmatic, sterile, philosophical postulates, it means that an ideology like that upheld by Museveni is dangerous. It's not useful. That's why Uganda is suffering today, because it is under the leadership of a man who has an ideology which he wants to pass on to all Ugandans by indoctrinating them at Chankwanzi Political School. That denies people their freedom, political freedom. And when that happens, ideology, of course, becomes a very dangerous thing. So stop here for today, and hope that you tune in next week and see what the next discussion or conversation will be. But we look forward for you joining us in this conversation. Thank you very much, and stay well until